Welcome, and thank you for standing by. At this time, participants' lines are in a listen-only mode. To ask a question during the question and answer session, press star 1 on the touch-tone phone. Today's conference is recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. This conference is recorded. I will now turn the meeting over to Dr. Holly Kirkendall. You may begin.
Thank you very much, Marcia. It's a beautiful spring day in Greensboro today, and it's a great day to talk about bees. I hope while you've joined our meeting today, you've noticed that we have several really good topics coming up on our webinar schedule, and we invite you all to join us for our next event. We've had a good time with Twitter recently and had some pretty good feedback from other states wanting to retweet our tweets. So for today, we have a really beautiful poster we're willing to give out to our first 10 new Twitter followers. So you'll note our Twitter address and our handle or our login. So if you'll go into Twitter and become a new follower today, we'll provide this beautiful poster to you. The process for that is I will look through the Twitter list and see who those top 10 are. I'll send you a direct message through Twitter asking for your shipping address, and if you'll respond to my direct message by email, then we'll take care of that for you. Today, Nancy has provided a handout that she will describe later, and I have also uploaded the CCA CEU form, so please go up to the upper right. There's an icon there that looks like 3 sheets of paper. You can open that little dialog box and click both buttons and download those attachments. You'll notice that the CCA form, I'm handling that a little bit differently. We had a suggestion from one of our participants that we use a fillable form, and we got permission from the CCA board that all that we really need is your name and your CCA number, and if you'll just complete that form electronically and email your page back to me, then I'll compile those and submit them for you. Please, no more scanning and faxing and no more printing and emailing. Just fill out the fillable form and email it directly back to me. And this is what the CCA form looks like. Today you get 1 hour of crop management credits, and again, that will be a fillable form. To ask questions today, if you'll notice on the left menu structure, there's a Q&A tab. You can open that up and you can type in your questions, and we'll try to handle all of those questions at the end of Nancy's presentation. Or like the operator said, you can press the function buttons as she described, and you can ask your question through the audio. Now, Nancy is bringing up her first slide, and I will introduce her to you. She's Dr. Nancy Lee Adamson. She's been on staff here at the Tech Center almost a year.
Oh,
half a year?
Yep, half a year.
She's been a wonderful addition for us, and I will let her get started with her topic.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Holly and the rest of the IT crew for setting this up. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you about bees and bee plants. I work both for the Xerces Society and the NRCS. So I hope most of you are familiar with both of those groups, but since most of you are from NRCS, I thought I would just highlight a little bit about the Xerces Society. And we are an invertebrate conservation group, and we celebrated 40 years of conservation in 2011. And we take our name from a butterfly that went extinct, the Xerces blue butterfly. And it was the first butterfly to go extinct due to human activities. And we do quite a lot of different work besides pollinator conservation. We work with endangered species and aquatic invertebrates as well. And I will talk about this a little bit at the end, but just in case you aren't able to stay for the whole program today, I wanted to highlight the resources that are available from the Xerces website. If you go to the Pollinator Conservation Resource Center on our site, you can click the map and find resources that are relevant for your region. And if you use that site, you'll find we have regional plant lists and links to identification guides, lots of information. If there's something that you know of that you think would be good for us to include, please do let me know. So today I'll be talking about common bees and best bee plants, and I know NRCS folks are generally interested in establishing habitat and also beneficial insects, and I know there are folks from outside NRCS as well. And if you're interested in those topics, you can find past webinars by Mace Vaughn and Eric Mader and David Orr on those topics. So today I'll be focusing on bees for the first half and plants on the second half. So bees are the most agriculturally important pollinators, and that's because they actively collect and transport pollen. And they do this to provide food for their young. And they exhibit what's called flower constancy, and that's because it takes energy to visit flowers, and not all flowers are equally rich in pollen or nectar at any given time. So once they find a good source of nectar or pollen, then they tend to keep visiting those plants until those resources are no longer very good. And so that makes them, for another reason, especially good pollinators, because if plants need cross-pollination, then they need to be of the same genus or species. So bees also regularly forage in the area around their nest, and most of our native bees don't travel quite as far as honeybees, although some of our bumblebees do. And so if you create good habitat or you protect good habitat around an area where you would like to increase visitation from native bees to your crops, chances are that'll work, just providing habitat and protecting those sites. So one of the reasons that bees are especially good at pollinating is they have adapted these special hairs for collecting pollen. Static electricity actually helps bring pollen from the flowers into their hairs. And they have special pollen-carrying apparatus sometimes on their abdomens, as shown here, and sometimes they have additional hairs or pollen-carrying baskets, like this bumblebee, and those are called scopa. Oops. It's going to take me a minute. So bees are extremely important in our ecosystems, and my boss Eric put this together with 70% of flowering plants requiring an insect to move pollen. Recent work by Allerton and colleagues looked at the importance of animal pollination in general, and they found that on average about 85% of plants need animals for pollination, and most of those are insects and most of those are bees. And they found that in North America that figure was closer to 80%, and as you went into the tropics, then that figure reached 95%. So they're extremely important. But also in our agricultural systems, bees play a vital role, and everyone is pretty familiar with the importance of honeybees, but oftentimes we underestimate or we don't always recognize the value of our native bees. And in the research I did in West Virginia, in southwestern Virginia, I found that honeybees made up only about 1/4 of the visitors. So that's this light blue color here. The rest of these visitors were all native bees. And this research was very similar. The results found in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Delaware, the Midwestern U.S., and also in the western states in California. So now I'm going to talk about native bee diversity. We have about 4,000 species of native bees in North America. about 700 of those in the East and in 66 genera. So I won't be covering all of these. I'll be focusing on bees that you might see pretty commonly and that are also readily distinguishable. So the three main groups of bees that we think about are solitary ground nesting bees, solitary wood nesting bees, and then bumblebees, which are a social group. And these groups are really important to consider if you want to conserve habitat or create habitat for them. So in the eastern U.S., we have about 26 species of bumblebees, and the diversity is greater as you go north. They're very hairy. They have dark bodies. They are adapted to flying in relatively cold conditions. And so the figures I've shown up here at the top just are to give you a sense of what the diversity is like. There's 26 species throughout the whole eastern U.S., and then the lowest diversity in Florida with 7 species, and the greatest up in Maine with 19. So bumblebees typically nest in abandoned abandoned mouse burrows. So if you have lodged grasses or brush piles, then these make great habitat for bumblebees. So a bumblebee queen will create a new colony by herself in the spring. She mated the previous fall along with other queens that were raised late in fall, and she overwinters by herself, and the rest of the colony dies. So then in spring, she emerges and starts a new colony by herself. She'll collect pollen and nectar and incubate her eggs. And when her daughters emerge, then she'll continue laying eggs, and her daughters will begin to collect pollen and nectar. So bumblebees are really extremely important pollinators due to their large size and hairy bodies, but they're also great buzz pollinators. And almost all of our solitary bees as well do what's called buzz pollination, and this means that they vibrate their wings at a certain frequency that allows pollen to be released from a kind of anther, a poricidal anther that holds pollen unless it's vibrated at the right frequency. And even though honeybees can vibrate their wing muscles, they don't reach the right frequency to release pollen from these flowers. And these include things in the heath family, so cranberry and blueberry and huckleberry, and things in the nightshade family, solanaceous species like tomato and peppers and eggplants. So if you're interested in trying to identify bees, there's a really nice guide for the eastern U.S. that Sheila Cola and colleagues have recently put together. This is available online as a PDF file, or you can order it. And it's included in the list of resources that you can find in the PDF attached that Holly talked about. The Xerces Society has these wanted posters and also these little pocket guides, and these are also great for identifying common species of bees. There are about 4 species of bees that have declined that used to be very common, and so Xerces is running a citizen science monitoring program. And so these little pocket guides you can print out. They include the uncommon species, but along with those, they include the most common species. So they make terrific field guides for learning some of the most common species. So in the eastern U.S., the most common bumblebee is Bombus impatiens, and this is now, unfortunately, escaped west of the Rockies from greenhouses, and that's because this species has been found to be easy to manage. So it's relatively easy to domesticate and use for pollination in greenhouses. Other common species, and if you look at Sheila's guide, she goes into more detail about all of these species. But there's a number of species that are more common throughout the whole East, and then a few species that are common just in the north and in the mountains south, and then a few that are just found up north. And those two, Rufocinctus and Turnarius, both have orange coloration, so are easy to spot. So the vast majority of our native bees are ground nesting solitary bees, and solitary bees means that the females and males emerge in spring and mate, and then the female excavates nests in the ground and provisions that nest by herself. She doesn't have co-workers or daughters to take care of these things for her, so she provisions her nest by herself. But because there aren't really great nesting sites everywhere, and they need pretty well-drained, sandy soils, you'll often find that these groups of bees aggregate their nests, or we also say that they have gregarious behavior. So they will have nests close together. And most of these species will line their nests with waxy glandular secretions. And so if you want to help conserve this group of bees, you need to scout for nests and conserve areas with sandy soil and bare ground. The life cycle of solitary bees is a little bit different than the social bees. The female and male emerge, they mate, and she excavates into the ground and will gather nectar and pollen and create a pollen ball, lay an egg on the pollen ball, and that hatches and goes through several instars, just like a caterpillar, and then it will pupate. It has complete metamorphosis, just like caterpillars. And then a lot of these species are univoltine, so that means there's one brood each year. So most of their life is spent underground. But some are multivoltine, so you'll see them throughout the season. Most bees are active just for a few weeks as an adult. So if you see them throughout the whole season, then chances are there are several generations. So the biggest group of ground nesting bees is Andrena. And out of 700 species in the East, 120 of those are Andrena. And these are very active in early spring. They're very important for apple and blueberry. They tend to be black. Some of them do have stripes on their abdomens. But this dark coloration helps them, just like bumblebees, collect solar radiation and retain some heat in the cooler temperatures of early spring. And here you can see they have this behavior, grabbing onto the anthers or diving right into the middle of flowers, and those make them especially effective in pollinating apples. And up in the top right-hand corner, you can see a male is a little bit smaller. That's true oftentimes among bees. Another extremely important ground nesting group in summertime is squash bees, and we have 3 species in the eastern U.S. Peponapis tends to be the more common species in the mid-Atlantic and farther north, and then as you go into Florida, Xenoglossa becomes more important. So these bees are specialists on squash, and when we talk about specialists in bees, that means they specialize on the pollen of flowers. So when we talk about specialist butterflies, that means that their young eat only a certain types of plants. And so in this case, the adults and young feed on only one kind of pollen, but the adults may gather nectar from a lot of different species. And the squash bees are about the size of honeybees, and so I think sometimes people don't realize that they have squash bees in their cucurbits. But once you realize and you go take a look, it's very easy to distinguish squash bees from honeybees. The males have a little white patch on their face, and they have longer antennae, and that's true of all bees. Males all have slightly longer antennae and sometimes much longer antennae than the females. And then the way they fly is very different from honeybees. The males will dart around between plants and just zip by, and the females are busy gathering nectar and pollen, and you'll mostly just see the rear end of the females, and you can recognize them. The males are hairy, but the females definitely have much hairier legs, and you'll see this black and white striping. And even though this is a ground nesting species, the males aren't nesting, so you'll often find the males nesting in flowers, and cucurbit flowers are just open in the morning. So the males find the flowers before they close and will hang out there until the next morning. Another species of bee that wasn't common where I was in Southwest Virginia, but are very easy to confuse with bumblebees because they're also relatively big and hairy, but bumblebees don't have males active until late summer. They don't produce males in their nests until late summer, when they also produce queens for the following season. And also, bumblebees don't have white patches on their face. So here's the white patch on a male, and he has slightly longer antennae. And these tend to be slightly smaller than most queen bumblebees. So in early spring, if you see some bumblebees that are a little smaller, they could be workers if it's later in spring. But if it's very early in spring, you can notice that they might be this southeastern blueberry bee. That's a specialist on blueberries. It's a little bit harder to tell the females, but once you start observing them, you'll see they have a little bit different way of flying. They seem to kind of leave their tongue hanging out as they fly around. But once you take a picture, you're going to wonder whether you have a bumblebee or a southeastern blueberry bee. Another group of ground nesting bees is longhorn bees, Melisodes, and then there are another couple genera that we call longhorn bees, and that's because the male antennae are particularly long in these groups of bees. In the eastern U.S. and I guess in the Midwest too, Melisodes bimaculata is a fairly common species. In the east, they emerge in midsummer, and you can recognize this. It's a all black bee, but it has these two little white spots on its rear end, and so that's the giveaway that that's Melisodes bimaculata. And a lot of these are specialists on asters, and including sunflowers. So other longhorn bees are generally a little bit chunkier in terms of body structure, but these pictures are a little bit deceptive. My colleague Jennifer calls these chaps. They look like chaps on the bees, and some of the Melisodes species do have big chaps as well. But their bodies are a little bit chunkier in general, at least in the eastern bees that I've seen, Eucer and Sevastra. And then we have about a dozen species of green sweat bees, besides Algochlora and Algochlorella and Algochloropsis. We have Agapostemon, which is coming up in the next slide. And these bees, some folks can recognize Algochlora pura in the field, but I pretty much need to use a microscope. But these bees are also important for pollination, and you can see this picture down in the bottom right-hand corner. This white substance here is pollen that she has collected after buzz pollinating a tomato flower. Tomato flowers don't produce nectar, so they're not very attractive to honeybees, so you rarely see a honeybee visiting tomatoes. And we generally think of tomatoes as not really needing bees for pollination except in greenhouse settings, but at least one study has found that with native bees present, the production of sun gold cherry tomatoes increased threefold, so they can really make a difference. So the other main group of green sweat bees is Agapostemon, and they're relatively easy to recognize in the field because they have these dramatic bright green thoraxes, and then a black and white abdomen. Sometimes they have a solid colored abdomen, but oftentimes it'll be black and white. On the males, it'll be yellow and black. And many of these nest communally as well. And there's a big group of little dark bees that can be hard to distinguish in the field, but Halictus legatus is probably the most common species, this one down here in the bottom left-hand corner. And again, these you'll find throughout the season. A lot of them are multivoltine, so they have multiple generations through the summer. And Coletes is called the polyester or plasterer or cellophane bee because of the secretions that it makes on its in its cells. So all of these ground nesting bees do line their cells with secretions, but this particular group of bees has very cellophane-like secretions. And Ty Ralston at the University of Virginia is one of the few folks who, rather than killing his bee specimens, he captures and releases his specimens. He puts on these very elaborate different patterns so he knows which bee he's caught, so he actually can keep track of them as individuals during his work. So cavity nesting bees make up about 30% of our solitary bees. And because of their nesting habits, they can be managed a little bit more than our ground nesting bees in general. So these bees depend on beetles a lot of times to bore holes in trees, and they also inhabit snags and some of our pithy-stemmed plants like elderberry and box elder, sumac, and things like that. So these old logs that have beetle holes or beetles in general that bore logs are important. So some things that we tend to think of getting rid of are really important for our ecosystems. And I know they're also important for birds and also for seedling plants in a forest system. So these cavity nesting bees have the same life cycle as the ground nesting bees, but their cells are much closer together in these cavities. And so you can see here that they just partition each cell with a little bit of mud, or sometimes some bees collect leaves and masticate that to divide their cells. And you'll notice that it's easy to see here at the back of this cavity, and they prefer cavities that don't open at both ends. The provisions are much larger at the back of the cavity than they are at the front of the cavity. So the subsequent larvae is also much larger down here at the back of the cavity. And these are the female bees, and the ones in the front are the males. So the males are sacrificing themselves to the parasites and birds that might more likely reach the front of the cell than the back. So some of the species that are more commonly managed are Osmia lignaria, and that's a native bee in the eastern U.S. It's a big blue osmia, and it's very important in spring in orchards. And then a couple introduced species for orchard pollination are Osmia taurus and Osmia cornuta. And then out west, Megachile rotundata, the alfalfa leafcutter bee, was introduced there. And because of their nesting habits, then we can place nests out and collect these at the end of the season, and then protect them over the winter, and then bring them out or sell them across the country for apple pollination or whatever fruit crop they're needed for. So osmia, most people are familiar with the blue orchard bee, but I don't think many people realize that we have 31 species of osmia that are found in the eastern U.S. And that includes this introduced species that they're very hard to tell at just glancing if it's Osmia cornifrons or Osmia taurus. But these bees, the native bees in general, tend to be dark green or dark metallic blue. And again, that's partly because they're early spring bees. They're active in cooler temperatures, and so they can gather solar energy more easily with those dark colors. And these bees, I didn't point out, one way you can recognize these is that their scopa is on their abdomen, and we saw that earlier in the earlier slide. But the other group that has this is Megachile, and these are very easy to recognize. They have very large heads, and then this kind of squared-off abdomen and the dramatic black and white striping. And again, this Megachile rotundata was introduced for alfalfa, but you do find that in the east as well. And then a cavity nesting bee that everybody's familiar with is the carpenter bee, of course. And you can distinguish this from bumblebees because they have much shinier abdomens in general. They do have hairs on their abdomen, but overall it's much shinier. And then the males are active in spring because these are also solitary bees, and the males have a white patch on their face. So you can see that there's a good chance this bee, along with bumblebees, evolved with the passion flower and that connection over time with plants. So we also have small carpenter bees, and these tend to nest in cavities in elderberry and sunflower and blackberry. And they also have relatively shiny abdomens. The females do have hairy legs, and they collect pollen on their legs. And once you start looking at bees, you will be able to recognize this from other Halictus and Lasioglossum, the other sweat bees. They have kind of a rounded off rear end, and they just have a distinctive color and form once you start paying attention. And again, these are active all season, so they're multivoltine. Well, about 20% of our bee species are actually cuckoo bees, and that means that they don't collect pollen and nectar for their own young. They lay their nests in the nests of other bees. And so these oftentimes don't have as many hairs as other bees, and they may be confused with wasps, such as this Sphecodes or Nomada are particularly unhairy. And this one you can see is probably a parasite in the group that it looks most similar to, Megachile. And oftentimes the parasitic bees have little projections or defensive structures on their bodies. So that was just kind of a highlight of the most common bees that you can run across. Of course, there's a lot more diversity out there, but I'm going to go ahead and move on to plants. And, you know, I can't really cover all the plants for the East for each state, so you're going to have to keep in mind that you need to find resources for your own state, and I know everybody realizes this. So I'll just be highlighting plants that in general we consider good for bees, and then also some research that has highlighted the value of some plants in the East. So when you are looking for plants for pollinator habitat, we want you to find plants with documented value. Avoid weed species, especially invasive species, and also species that might be alternate hosts for some pests or diseases. And then you need to keep in mind that bees need plants throughout the growing season. And for all the NRCS programs, conservation plantings, they're actually required to include, in general, 3 species for the spring, 3 species for summer, and 3 species for the fall. And down in Florida, they actually have bees active earlier in the winter, so they consider that they have 4 seasons they need to provide for. But for most of the East, it would be 3 seasons. And in the spring, because we don't have as many wildflowers blooming, or a lot of them tend to be the understory species, we really depend a lot on trees and shrubs that are in flower in spring. And so here we have maple and willow. And then later through the season, you'll have a whole bunch of other things in flower. So for NRCS folks, I know you're familiar with the Field Office Technical Guide, but for others, this is information. Most states do have a list of plants that have been developed for pollinators, and Xerces is also working to revise or develop job sheets for every state. But for folks who aren't familiar with NRCS, you also can access these resources by going to the NRCS website and looking for the Field Office Technical Guide. And there, most states will have various information for pollinator habitat. So for instance, in Pennsylvania, they have the Conservation Reserve Program job sheet. And CP stands for Conservation Practice, and the number is 42. And so this job sheet actually includes a list of species that NRCS folks have found are available and work well in plantings in Pennsylvania, and in general are native species unless they're for cover crops. So in the eastern U.S., there is some ongoing research right now in New Jersey looking at some of these plants that are known to be valuable for bees as well as other pollinators that are available, and also relatively inexpensive and are good, are easy to establish. So these are the species that they're looking at. Rachel Winfrey from Rutgers University is working with the folks at the Cape May Plant Materials Center, that's part of NRCS, in New Jersey, Chris Miller and Jolie Dollar and the rest of the crew there. And so they grouped plants. They have E here stands for early, M stands for mid, and L stands for late. So they looked at all of these plants, and they found that in New Jersey, the plants that came out in terms of highest visitation by bees and butterflies was milkweed, butterfly milkweed, and also Rudbeckia for bees, which I know this is going to surprise Eric Meader, although he's probably seen this. But my boss, Eric, worked out in the Midwest, and whenever he looked at Rudbeckia, when other flowers were there were very few visits to Rudbeckia. But it may be that Rudbeckia hirta, because it's a little bit earlier than some of the other Rudbeckias, has more value to bees than at other times of the year. So in the mid-season, they found that Lobelia syphilitica, which is the blue cardinal flower, and then hyssop, which is agastache, and mountain mint, which is Pycnanthemum tenuifolium, were very important. And there wasn't really a difference for butterflies. And butterflies are gathering nectar only. And then late in the season, they found Eupatorium, which on the list earlier has the new name, Eupadoria delphis or something. And then Oligoneuron, which used to be called Solidago. And so these are goldenrods, the Oligoneuron. And then the Eupatorium is Joe Pyeweed. These were most important in late season. So this webinar will be available for replay, so you'll have plenty of time to come back and look through these slides and also at the resources. But just to recap, these are the species that they found were most important. They didn't include Monarda species in their plantings, and I'm not sure if that had to do with availability of seed at the time, but I'm sure that if they included Monarda, which is bee balm, or that would also be among the top species for pollinators. So if you just wanted to find resources for bees without reference to the NRCS websites, there's a terrific resource available now at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildlife Wildflower Center, and Xerxes helped put together these lists. If you go to the main web page, you can click on this area, Recommended Species List, and that'll take you to this blue map and also these special collections. And if you just type in collections after the main website, that'll take you right to that page. And it includes special collections for butterflies and moths, and then values to beneficial insects, including native bees, bumblebees, honeybees, and then nesting material. And so if you click on any of these, then once you pull up that narrower database, then you can click on your state and then other things that you're interested in, if it's a tree or a perennial, and then the light or soil conditions that are needed. So this is a really terrific resource. We tried to just emphasize plants that we knew had documented value. That doesn't mean that the plants that aren't listed aren't also valuable, but this is kind of the cream of the crop. So I'm going to go through these plant lists sort of quickly just to highlight some of the plants that we know of that are really great for bees. But of course, you're going to need to check in your region. Not all of these are found throughout the whole eastern U.S. But in spring, native trees are really, really valuable in terms of pollen and nectar. And things like maple and willow are all tried and true. And then you'll see that malice, crabapple, that's a relative of our cultivated apple. So it's not surprising that our bees are readily adapted to pollinating our cultivated species as well. Whoops, I skipped a slide there. And then other spring blooming shrubs and small trees are really important, and these are great if you want to put in a hedgerow that includes early spring shrubs and trees as well as summer blooming perennials. And redbud in particular is really valuable in spring for bees, but all of these are great. And we have a tremendous diversity of wild blueberries and huckleberries that make great hedgerow plants that you can also harvest fruit from. And then in the springtime, in terms of restoration plantings, I think that's probably the tougher group to get seed for. A lot of times some of the seed is a little bit more expensive, but things like penstemon, those tend to be a little bit less expensive, and some of the salvias. And you can collect seed from a lot of these if you want to just supplement a planting or work if you're working with a homeowner that wants to provide pollinator habitat. They can do a lot to raise these things on their own. And then in summertime, we have a lot of shrubs that would naturally be found in riparian areas, and these are really vital, especially in natural areas during drought times. Oftentimes, you won't find plants in flower except along these riparian areas, but even though a lot of them are naturally found in wetter sites, they're all adapted to medium soil conditions, and some of them actually do perfectly well on drier sites as well. And then summer blooming plants, I know that for the New Jersey study they included lobelia in the summertime, and that kind of highlights there's going to be quite a range in bloom times depending on where you're located in the east. So just take these lists with a grain of salt and look into the bloom times in your own region. But again, the one plant that wasn't highlighted in the New Jersey study was the monardas. All of the monardas, there's a big variety. This one happens to be Monarda fistulosa, but Monarda punctata is also a great one. And so don't forget Monarda when you're thinking. And then, of course, the mountain mints were included in that group, and then the Joe Pye, which I don't have a picture of. But there's also a big diversity of mountain mints. The one they highlighted was this narrow-leaved species. So milkweeds have really gotten a lot of attention. Some research out west looked at their value not only for pollinators but for beneficial insects. And so I just wanted to emphasize them. Xerces is actually doing work to help bring some milkweeds into seed production that aren't available widely. And a recent study highlighted how since 2000 there's been a drastic decline in monarch butterflies in the Midwest, and largely this is associated with the increased use of Roundup Ready crops. So that has produced a 60% decline in milkweeds there. So when you're thinking about plantings, try to include milkweed as part of the mix. And just one, I know for farmers it's going to be hard to convince them to include thistles because we've been working so hard to eradicate our non-native thistles, but there are a lot of really valuable native thistles. All the thistles are actually great for bees, and the native species aren't invasive or aggressive, and some of them are pretty easy to tell. So if you're protecting an area, before you get rid of the thistles, check to see what species it is. And then there are a lot of non-native plants that aren't invasive. A lot of these are annual species that are used for cover crops, or they're garden herbs like oregano and catmint that are tremendously valuable for bees and make a good addition to some plantings, even if you want to just use them to help create cover the first season. So in addition to pollen and nectar sources, we need to also keep in mind that these plantings and our lands in general are providing shelter for bees. And males aren't going to the nests for shelter. They often utilize plants for protection. And so we also need to consider in places where there might be pesticide drift, creating plantings that don't attract bees. And so for a hedgerow or a windbreak, you need to use small needled evergreens like spruce or juniper, fir or arborvitae, not pines. Pines tend to open too much. The pines, the growth habit is too open over time. And then also remember that bees aren't going to recognize borders on our lands, and so they may inhabit places that we wouldn't think about. Sometimes farmers are very aware of not spraying their crops that are insect pollinated, but they might not realize that bees are also gathering pollen from corn. Now, certain varieties of corn seem to be a lot more attractive to bees than others, but just keep in mind that bees could be found anywhere on your property or on the property you're working with. So another important consideration is forb versus grass plantings. So a lot of our wildlife folks have been promoting grassland plantings for years. We have well-established protocols for doing these plantings. We know exactly how many pounds of grass to recommend, and we have particular herbicides that work well for grasses that kill broadleaf weeds. But these same methods don't work for forb plantings, and that has to do with the herbicides kill broadleaf weeds, which are most of our perennial forbs, and then the number of seeds per pound in our forbs can really vary. So here you can see in the red some of the seeds per pound for our different forb species. And so when people start trying to put together a planting, sometimes they get the impression that the cost is just exorbitant. And so in order to make sure you have enough seed for the planting so you have a successful planting, then we recommend using seeds per square foot to estimate how much seed you need for your acreage. And we also, if you can, get pure live seed. But in general, on average, most of your seed is going to be about 90% pure, even if you don't get pure live seed on average. So you can still use these seed calculators. And when you're coming up with estimates for seeds per square foot, we recommend 25 to 35 if you're using a drill seeder, and 40 to 60 for broadcast seeding. And this is not that easy to use a seed calculator. The NRCS is developing some regional calculators, and a lot of states already have calculators in their seed lists for pollinators. So, but for folks that don't have these or haven't used them, if you need help, that's something I can help with, and other NRCS folks can help with. So additional resources, I really want to recommend Attracting Native Pollinators. This was written by my bosses, Eric Mader and Mace Vaughn, with help from experts from across the country. And it really is a comprehensive manual, not just about bees, but all the groups of pollinators with fantastic photographs and information about habitat establishment and resources for planting. Really comprehensive guide. And then again, we have this terrific resource page that you can go to for regional resources. And some of these actually do link back to NRCS resources, but NRCS also has a fantastic number of pollinator resources available. And so just want you to remember that a diverse community of wild native bees can provide significant pollination for many crops, that habitat supports wild and managed pollinators. So basically anything that you do to support native pollinators is going to benefit honeybees and vice versa. And I would like to thank Sam Jogi, who has a tremendous number of resources up through Discover Life and the Handy Bee Manual. He has promoted bee monitoring in the East. And also Holly Kuykendall, who's helped me get this webinar set up and running, and all the other groups that have supported us. And I want to thank you all and take any questions.
Thank you. At this time, we'll begin question and answer session. To ask a question, press *1 on your touch-tone phone. Please unmute the line and record your first and last name when prompted. To withdraw the question, press *2. Once again, please press *1 to ask a question. One moment, please.
Thank you, Nancy, for the presentation. And while we're getting started with the Q&A, I'd just like to comment that it's always a pleasure to receive training from the Xerces Society and all the members, and you, Nancy, as well. They're always beautiful and very well presented. We had a question come in from Michelle online, and her question is, if honeybee hives are on farm, will those bees compete with native bees? Will they drive away those bees?
So, Michelle, this question is not that simple. It is kind of hard to study how bees interact because there's very few places where there aren't any honeybees. Even if there aren't hives, there are usually honeybees present. But one big difference between most native bees and honeybees is that native bees, because they're solitary, they don't recruit their sisters to the resources. So a solitary bee is kind of visiting plants within her territory, and she doesn't find out from her sister that, oh, here, there's a much better resource over here a quarter mile away. So sometimes if people have honeybee hives on their farms all year round, you won't actually find honeybees on the crops if there are better resources near the crops. And there are a few studies that actually show complementary roles between honeybees and native bees. So out in California, where they raise hybrid sunflowers. When native bees were present, honeybees actually changed their behavior and were more efficient pollinators. And then in another study of strawberries in France, they found that honeybees tended to visit the lower part of the flower, whereas the native bees tended to visit the upper part of the flower for some reason. And so this meant that overall the fruit was better formed when both groups were present. The biggest issue with honeybees is probably disease, and so because we're shipping honeybees around and they are sharing flower resources, there are diseases that are carried in pollen, and so it's more likely that disease is going to be transferred through different parts of the country via honeybees, and there's very little that we can do to control that. So one of the things that is being encouraged now is, if you are raising honeybees, to try to get queens locally so that there's less movement from farther away.
Okay, Nancy, Carl submits a question, and his question is like this. I'm involved in setting up butterfly gardens in urban areas. Please recommend some websites for guidance on establishing butterfly gardens. Then as a follow-up, what is the status of the colony collapse disorder with the honeybees?
Let's see. So for establishing butterfly gardens, there are lots and lots of books about this. If you could write to me, Carl, I'd be happy to send you links for that. There are resources on our website as well, the Xerces site. The status of colony collapse disorder, we still don't fully understand what is going on with colony collapse disorder. It's probably a mixture of things, so neonicotinoids have gotten a lot of attention lately, but we don't think that it's really just one thing. So it probably has to do with pesticides and poor diet, and sometimes some of the pests that are affecting honeybees actually affect their immune systems or carry disease, and so right now we think it's kind of a complex of things.
Okay, Tom Ward submits a question. Are any of the pests that have recently been introduced into honeybee colonies crossed over to native bees? You might want to follow up, and then such as parasitic mites and bee viruses.
So I don't know the answer to whether specific mites have moved over. I do know that they suspect that some of the decline in bumblebees is from native bees that were taken from the U.S. So Bombus impatiens was moved to Europe for domestication, where they already had a domesticated bee from Europe, and so they worked with our native bee, and then that bee was actually reintroduced into greenhouse situations in the U.S. But it subsequently, we didn't keep that bee inside the greenhouse all the time. Sometimes they escaped, and we think that some of that disease was carried over to some of our native populations that are in decline now. Okay.
I do have a question on the phone.
Okay.
Deborah Bunn, your line is open.
Yes, my question is the territory of these bees, if there's a number of acres or how many miles that we're looking at, and then within that framework, what would be a reasonable habitat to start with? The acreage.
Okay. In terms of size?
Yes.
Yeah. So the distance that bees are going to travel really varies based on their body size, and so bumblebees are going to travel the farthest, and honeybees are known to travel quite a distance as well. But in general, we like to think of 500 feet from the crop, so as long as you can have habitat that's within that distance. And I don't know if we have some kind of idea of a minimum area, so I don't really have an answer for you there, but I can look that up and get it back to you if you can email me.
Thank you.
Once again, if you'd like to ask a question, it's *1 on the touch-tone phone. And one moment, please.
Let's see. Debbie Roos asked if there's a difference between Pycnanthemum tenuifolium and Pycnanthemum virginianum. And in terms of use for bees, I'm sure they're both great. And I don't know how to distinguish the two from each other, Debbie. But all of the Pycnanthemums are terrific for bees. I think virginianum may have slightly bigger leaves than tenuifolium.
And no questions on the phones.
There are a couple other questions. Jan Petruzzi asked, what impact do Africanized bees have on native bees? So Africanized honeybees don't have any different influence than other honeybees. Right now, Africanized honeybees are just found in the southern U.S., and they tend to swarm more than other honeybees, but their impact wouldn't be any different than other honeybees.
There is a question on the phones. Mark Goodland, your line is open.
Thank you. Do you have any guidance on, in working with landowners, how much pollinator habitat to recommend, you know, in for whatever situation they may have, size of the farm and crop farms versus orchards versus other situations?
Yeah, I should know the answer to this, and I'm thinking that we like to have at least a quarter acre, but I need to find this out, and maybe I can add that information to the information sheet when we post the replay. So I'll add some minimum acreage information.
Thank you.
Okay.
And once again, *1 on the audio portion.
Andy submits a question, and it goes like this. The heavy use of Roundup has created superweeds like henbit and wild garlic. How is this impacting wild bee populations?
I do not know how much bees use wild garlic. I know they use some of the Asian onion flowers quite a bit, and it does flavor the honey a little bit. And henbit is an excellent bee flower, so that shouldn't impact bees negatively.
Bruce submits a question. What are the benefits of registering your beehives?
Well, I don't know if that's a state regulatory thing, so each state is a little bit different. So I don't know if there's any benefit. Sorry.
Once again, *1 to ask a question. And I currently have no questions right now.
Well, Nancy, do you have any more follow-up or any other comments before we move on?
No.
But slide real quick. We did have some curiosity in this one first on where we can get where you can access replays. In a couple of days, we'll have the replay available to all participants and others. We post the replay and Nancy's handout and any kind of supplemental information along with her PowerPoint. That will be available at the East NTSC Webinars webpage. You can use that short link there to get there, or you can just go to the NRCS homepage and search for East NTSC Webinars and pull that page up. It'll have the complete listing. And for NRCS employees, you can visit the Science and Technology Training Library. We'll have the replay up there in a couple of days as well. I would like to remind all the CCAs to please complete your fillable form and submit that back to me in a couple of days. And I will mention that we have a couple of other webinars coming up. On Thursday, May 3rd at 3 p.m. Eastern, we have Introduction to Adaptive Nutrient Management. And on Wednesday, May 9th at 2 o'clock Eastern, we have Implementing NRCS Practice Standard Feed Management. So we welcome you all to join us at that time. And I thank Nancy today for giving us a nice presentation. And please be in touch with Nancy if you have questions. Thank you. That concludes the meeting today. Thank you very much.